Thank you, everybody. I have to try to channel that little girl. Are you ready, ladies and gentlemen? What beautiful energy. Can I have the first slide? I wanted to talk today because as I was thinking about education for change making, I started thinking about people who have really influenced my life, who have helped me to feel bigger and more courageous, and also taught me something about education that maybe I didn't know before I met them. So this is Jane Jacobs. How many people here have heard of Jane Jacobs or know who she is? Okay, so I'll explain. Jane Jacobs wrote many books. She wrote books about economics, about more cultures and how they affect moral behavior. But this is the book that she's really famous for, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And it's a book that was published in 1961, and it redefined the way people think about cities. When this book was published, prior to The Death and Life of Great American Cities, the way that cities were designed and planned was largely from a top-down model, where you would have single-use zones for certain cities, and there was this garden city idea where you could build large towers and surround them with large open green areas. And the idea that cities should actually reflect the needs of people and should actually grow out of the interactions of people and should be related to the scale of people had in some ways been forgotten in the 20th century. And so what Jane Jacobs saw living in New York City were these projects, these high-rise projects, and of course we see them all around the country now, the projects that have become, in some cases, the most despairing parts of the United States. So she came to New York City and wrote this book, and I'm going to skip over how she educated herself. I'm just going to tell you about the impact of the book. It not only did it transform the way we think about cities, but it actually engaged an entire generation of city planners to look at the scale of cities and to look at actually how we can create situations where people in cities become more neighborly, more part of a community. So what's contained in this book? It's deceptively simple if you look at it. The book has chapters like the uses of sidewalks, why small blocks are better than big blocks, why it's good to have, and she was very specific, why are small blocks better than big blocks? They're better because people like to turn left and right. They like options. It lends more variety. If you're ever walking down a very long block without any turns, you realize that it's not that interesting. You lose interest in it. There's fewer people that want to walk on those blocks and actually be in those blocks. She looked at how sidewalks create safety. She said, actually, safety comes from having many eyes on the street. It was called the Stoop theory of safety. She looked at how when a neighborhood was created that had mixed uses, where people came and went at different times, that they were more interesting and safer places, rather than having one district where everybody worked and at 5 p.m. it was a dead zone. It was actually a dangerous place to go. And she looked at how important it was to have old buildings in newer neighborhoods, because old buildings are the places where we house new ideas. All of us who are starting social organizations or struggling authors or whoever we may be need an old building that is able to afford a lower rent so we can start our ideas. And she put all these ideas together in this book, and the impact was tremendous, but the way it was received was very interesting. People said she was an aesthetic Philistine. They derided her as, they called it home remedies for urban cancer. They called her a dilettante. They called her an amateur. Actually, an amateur means someone who does something for the love of it, which is really the truth. But in fact, the book transformed, and it probably is the most important book on urban planning of the 20th century. And today, as we look at what's happening with the World Trade Center site, the architect, Alex Garvin, was deeply influenced by Jane Jacobs, and that's the reason why that site is now going to be reintegrated into the grid of Manhattan rather than kept as a huge closed area where people would have to walk around or avoid and so forth. So now, how did Jane Jacobs actually come up with her ideas? She actually never graduated from college. She moved to New York City, and she had never been a good student in high school. She had been a troublemaker in high school. She moved to New York, and she started taking random classes at Columbia University, Columbia General Studies. And finally, it was the first time in her life that she actually started enjoying school and actually started getting good grades. Move this down a bit. So she took courses in zoology, and in geology and in law and economics and politics, and she loved them. The problem was she started getting so many credits that they shifted her over to Barnard, and Barnard told her she had to go into a program, and they said, you have to take these courses. And she was very upset that she couldn't take what she wanted to. But fortunately, her high school transcript was so bad that Barnard didn't accept her. So she said, I was able to continue my education. Okay? And what was her education? This is one of the most interesting pages in her book. It says, just a page that says illustrations. Look around you. As you're walking around cities, pay attention, linger, and think about what you're seeing. And this is really how she educated herself to write this great book. She would walk around New York City or Philadelphia or Boston's North End, and she would pay attention. Why are people sitting on benches here, and why are the benches vacant there? Why does this street feel unsafe? And as she was doing that, she would get tours of certain areas, and she found that in East Harlem, an area that she thought was chaotic, if she took a tour with somebody who really knew the area, she could understand the very subtle order that existed there, a very nuanced sense of order, a very deep order that had been completely missed. And some of these neighborhoods, like Greenwich Village and Boston's North End, were actually slated for slum clearance. People were going to bulldoze them because they thought, because of the density levels, that these were dying neighborhoods that needed to be revitalized. And of course, Jane Jacobs later became an activist and prevented Greenwich Village from having an expressway running right through it, the Lower Manhattan Expressway that Robert Moses wanted to build, which would have destroyed Greenwich Village and Soho. And similarly, plans like that were happening in Toronto and in Boston's North End. So she became an activist protecting cities. One of the things that she did while she didn't have university mentors or college professors to bounce ideas off of. So what she did was she created imaginary conversations with people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, people whose biographies she had read and who she deeply admired. And she said Thomas Jefferson was wonderful to have a conversation with because he was interested in everything. And whatever you told him, you always got good advice back. And Benjamin Franklin was even better because when you had a conversation with him, he would always encourage you to simplify your ideas, make them easier to understand, a little bit clearer, a little bit more concise, and so forth. And so using these tools, and she read widely, the courses that she took didn't fall into, she jumped disciplines and categories, and she brought it all together. And then she concluded her book with a theory of how to look at cities. And if you read that theory, it's really how to look at anything. And as I've thought about it, it's really how all change makers go about the process of building a new change in the world. And she came up with 3 points. And the first one was, when you look at things that are occurring in the world, try to understand the processes that are causing them. So think about process, not just the result. And the second thing was to think inductively rather than deductively, which is to say to work from particular and very small units of information and get a lot of them, and after a while you can generalize those into a theory, or you can begin to tease out principles. And the third one was to look for unaverage or surprising clues that give you a sense that the world is not really the way you may think it is, and give you a sense of really what's possible and how the world really works. So for example, if you think of Muhammad Yunus, the fact that a few villagers in the Grameen Bank paid back those early loans, that was an unaverage clue that something might be possible that other people had not yet recognized. But he paid attention to those very small clues. Now the interesting thing is there's a wonderful quote or a wonderful story by Samuel Johnson where he talks about what is genius? What is genius? And people, he says genius is so misunderstood. Genius is simply understanding the uses of things, is what Samuel Johnson says. And he gives this very simple example. He says if 2 men are walking down a path and there's an overturned wagon, a person with no genius will notice the wagon and will walk on. But the person with genius will look at the wagon and will paint it to themselves, standing upright and moving and carrying a heavy load. The person with genius can imagine the uses of that wagon. And then the final point, the most important point is, both of them have to see the wagon to think of it at all. So genius ultimately requires these exposures. You have to be out in the world and you have to be getting lots and lots of information from the world, like Jane Jacobs did when she was walking through the streets of New York City and later Toronto. Now when I was thinking about what are the kinds of exposures that really help people or really help change makers that I have noticed through my own research, and it's really clear that they fall into a pattern. There's clearly some exposures that people get that allow them to see the world in a different way, that break them out of seeing the world through simply one model of understanding. So for example, exposures that help a doctor understand the social consequences or the social causes of illness, or that help a teacher understand the emotional parts of learning rather than just the cognitive aspects of it, or that help an economist understand the behavioral aspects of economics rather than simply economic man type of thinking. So and then finally, these exposures, there are exposures that help you see alternative pathways that you may not have thought of. Doctors today, nurses today, urban planners, computer programmers, writers like myself, if they have exposures, they can think of a different way they could be a journalist, a different way they could be a doctor. And then finally, the most important are exposures that help you to reimagine possibilities, that help you to see the world in a way that's totally fresh and new, and particularly that give you relationships that bond you with people so that you have a lot of motivation to cause the kind of change that you would like to cause. And so if you look at all of these exposures and you put them together, the main question is, how can universities encourage in their structures these kinds of exposures and understandings on a regular basis that really build this capacity to cause change? And secondly, if the universities aren't doing it, how can we all be hunter-gatherers so that we make sure that we fight for these exposures and these understandings for ourselves, whether or not it actually works in the structure that we're in? Jane Jacobs died in 2006. She was 89. And this was, many flowers were left on her doorstep at 555 Hudson Street, where she had lived for more than 30 years before moving to Toronto, where she lived for 40 years because of the Vietnam War. And thousands of people came out to her to celebrate her. Today there are Jane's Walks all around Canada to celebrate community. Thousands of people participate in them. And I think that this quote that was left with a bouquet of flowers on her door really sums up her legacy. From this house in 1961, a housewife changed the world. Thanks very much.